we know the gaps are there. Sometimes we don't know what the gaps are and the nature of them, cause, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the real crunch point, the real sort of turning point is, well, what do we do about it? How do we bridge that gap? I met someone on holiday in Thailand, and she works for all sorts of governments. She's worked with Bush and Obama and so forth as a high-level negotiator on women's rights in the Middle East. It's a very high stakes with, life and death. Boko Haram, she's worked with survivors from Boko Haram, the terrorist group, Palestinian woman she is. But we were talking about conflict resolution and intercultural. In fact, Christian, I should put you onto her because she works in the thick of all of this. And we were talking about Arabic culture and American government trying to understand or not failing to understand Arabic culture and Arabic tribal differences and all sorts of things. But what I wanted to make is this question. She said, rather than in negotiation, which she does a lot of from high stakes negotiation, she doesn't see it as trying to she doesn't want people to compromise. This was not a very full conversation, but she talked about trying to help people bridge that gap so that it was still a win-win. And I guess that's another way of looking at this and saying, well, yeah, what are the ways that we can still get what we want and the other party can get what they want without us feeling like we're having to give up something important?
Knowing about the differences is nice and dandy, and knowing about differences only will not serve us. So we need to be aware of them and then think and act accordingly in order to minimize them. My favorite strategy for bridging any gap between humans in their behavioral disconnects is humility. Combined with, and that's basically two superpowers, humility combined with vulnerability. And those are two things that in Western, mostly Western European, Anglo-Saxon context are not easily learned. I already put in some of the countries that we've been talking about, and we will look at the profiles of these four countries. So we have Australia in blue, we have Germany in green, we have South Korea in orange, and the US in purple.
My framework is more of a framework about situations and what the norms are, sort of the cultural behavioral style in a certain situation. That's what I think my framework would be about, sort of like, the expectations for formality and enthusiasm and assertiveness and so on. When I wrote Global Dexterity, I struggled with this issue because, how can you, because I see danger in assigning sort of some cultural norm to these elements, right? That the Germans are like this and the French are like that. And though I also see that it's important, the way that I approach it in terms of understanding these things is I approach it like from a statistical point of view, that if you have a normal curve from statistics class, there'll be an average, right, in that normal curve, but then there'll be deviations from the average. And so when you talk about, let's say we're talking about something like emotional expressiveness, and you're comparing Swedes and Italians. Like, who do you think's more emotionally expressive on average? The average Swede or the average Italian?
Italian.
Right, the average Italian is probably right. If you could do a research study and you could study every single Italian and every single Swede and somehow come up with a score for emotional expressiveness, on the scale of emotional expressiveness, the Italian average would probably be higher than the Swede. But there's going to be a normal curve around that. So you're going to find Italians who are extremely, emotionally expressive, and you'll also find Italians who are not very emotionally expressive at all. Same with Swedes. The typical average Swede will be a little less than the typical Italian. But you'll find some super extroverted, emotionally expressive Swedes, and then some who are very reticent and so on. So my point is that I think that these cultural difference frameworks, no matter which one you use, it's useful to think about it in those terms, that you're capturing a prototype, but that the individual person that you might happen to interact with or meet will probably deviate from that prototype. That doesn't mean you shouldn't have the prototype in your head. It just should not be some sort of fixed image. So that's the way I approach these things.
When it comes to doing the work, as Christian says, I do the same work as he does, and probably to a lesser informed and capable degree than he does. But isn't that very? That's what we do, Justin. We understate our accomplishments in Australia.
Was this a perfect example of a poppy that did not allow itself to grow tall? This was tall poppy syndrome at its best.
Thinking I was 6 foot tall and bulletproof and immune from culture shock, and of course, we have the assumption here when we move to America that everybody loves Aussies, all right, and we can get by and make fools of ourselves when everyone will forgive us because we're that. The Americans really have a perception of Australians that we're very friendly and we're open and that kind of thing, and that's what we do. Of course, that stops when you start to do business with Americans. You can only take that so far, and that's what has affected a lot of Australian businesses, and in some cases sent them home packing with their tail between their legs from this wonderful big country that offered so much opportunity, but then they were confronted by a wall that they thought would never exist. That's
one of the reasons why on every call, the first thing I ask you is there a story you can tell from what happened last week? So even if you can't always think of one, let this be the takeaway, one of the takeaways from tonight, that you go through your week before we meet again next week. Go through your week and make a mental note of a story. As mundane as it may seem to you in the moment, it may just be your non-relevant experience. However, in the context of our group and what we do here, it might just be the one nugget of wisdom that Andreas or Hannah or I or Justin or Marcus will need.
All right. Well, take care, everybody. You're all in good hands with Christian.